and bear, in other words carry, arms, in other words weapons, be they firearms or a sword or a knife, or if you could carry a tank. I don't know many people who could. Like, I don't know anybody who could. But in blatant reality, if you can legally acquire it, you're allowed to own it, as far as weapons go. And if you own it, you're allowed to carry it. And the government is not allowed to restrict that or take it away from you. That's what the Second Amendment says. And people say, well, that doesn't apply to military arms. Actually, it very much applies to military-style weapons. In fact, the one case that all the gun control people try to put forward, which is the Miller case, over a sawed-off shotgun that went to the Supreme Court, that one, they said that the shotgun was not covered by the Second Amendment because it was not a military-style firearm. There was no military application for it. So that's why that one was not protected. So all these bans on so-called assault rifles are actually counter to the Miller decision. So there goes that argument by the gun control advocates right back at them. They need to read the fine print. But Texas does not have constitutional carry. And constitutional carry just simply is, if you can legally own it, you can legally carry it. Period. And trying to tell you what you can and can't own, that's up to question too on whether or not that's even allowed. But excuse me. The fine Texas weather decided it wanted to interfere in my voice a little bit there. I apologize. But anyway, yeah, like I said, constitutional carry. If you own it, you can carry it. So that's not what Texas currently has. So it's not all as free with guns as people think. But we're going to get away a little bit from the Second Amendment. Maybe. No, actually, no. Since we're still talking about the Second Amendment, I do have a couple of things here, but we're gonna kind of move away from Texas a little bit and discuss other Second Amendment things. We're going to talk about our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. So, first, let's start over with another BuzzPo article. Once again, I think this one was Eric Reid. Yes, it was. Eric Reid has this picture of a lovely young lady in a uniform with giving a thumbs up. And if you look really closely at her uniform, she is the chief of police for Washington, D.C. She is basically, based on the last little court order that came out, court decision that came out, saying that their bans on carrying firearms in Washington, D.C. is unconstitutional, she turned around and flat out gave an order to all of her officers and said, if you see anybody openly carrying or concealed carrying, you're not to arrest them. Not on that charge anyway. If they do something else illegal, of course. But no, you don't arrest just for having a weapon in public. So she basically, through executive fiat, so to speak, has said we're going to have constitutional carry in D.C. until the D.C. local legislature can get their craniums, out of, corrected from the rectal cranial inversion. But yeah, that's interesting development there. It's basically based on the court decision and lacking any constitutional legislation saying otherwise. She said, hey, D.C. is now a constitutional carry city. And of course, because D.C. does not fall under the purview of any state, that means they don't have to worry about a state law governing whether or not you're allowed to carry and what you're allowed to carry. So, kind of a smart move, I think, on behalf of Police Chief Kathy Lanier regarding D.C. And I think there's, several other states that need to kind of take that cue and go back to constitutional carry. However, coming out of that, looking over at Dana Loesch's personal blog, she's got an interesting little thing to consider here. Is although they had the overturning of the gun bans in D.C., the next subject that's going to come up with a serious court case appears to be one that there's a policy that allows doctors to take away somebody's Second Amendment rights. And the VA has been doing this. A vet goes in to get himself screened because they're told, you were over in Iraq, you saw explosions, or you were over in Afghanistan, you were near, explosions. So, you should go and get yourself screened for a TBI, for a traumatic brain injury, even if it's a mild one. And maybe maybe you have some more benefits coming to you, maybe you have some help, maybe it'll, whatever. You're having difficulty sleeping, so get checked out, or you have headaches now, get it checked out. So just by going in being screened, you've had, not even necessarily doctors, it's people within the VA turning around and taking away Second Amendment rights from veterans just because they're going to get screened, not diagnosed, but just showing up for the screenings. And this has been going on for a couple of years, and you've even had other instances that had nothing to do with TBI or PTSD or anything like that. You had one veteran go in, and somehow it came out that his wife, the accountant, had been handling the family finances for a couple of decades. Well, suddenly that got listed as he is incapable of handling his own affairs, and declared that he is unfit to own a weapon because his wife, who is an accountant, handled the finances in the home. My wife handles the finances in my home largely because she's more organized. She's better at it than I am. So, division of labor. She does the things she's better at. I cook because I'm a better cook. It's the way we do things. We make the decisions together, but she manages that part. Does that mean that I can't manage my own affairs? I managed my own finances for decades before we got married. So it's just what we decided upon and are doing at the current time. Who knows? It may change in the future. We never know. Anyway, according to Dana Loesch here, it's being brought up on whether or not doctors can invade patients' privacy, even question about anything outside of direct medical questioning. And she has a quote on here. I'm trying to see what the source is. I can't see the source. But Dana has a block quote that states, "A Florida law restricting what doctors can tell patients about gun ownership was deemed to be constitutional by a federal appeals court, which said it legitimately regulates professional conduct and does not violate the doctor's First Amendment free speech rights." I interject here. It's First Amendment free speech. Yeah, the doctor can say, "I don't like guns." They can do it all they want. They're allowed to be dumb. But that doesn't mean they can take away people's rights. So let's see what else Dana has quoted in here. "The ruling by the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta overturned a previous decision that had blocked the state from enforcing the law. The 2011 law, which had become popularly known as the Docs versus Glocks, was challenged by organizations representing 11,000 state health providers, including the Florida chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Family Physicians. Doctors who break the law could potentially be fined and lose their licenses. By a 2-to-1 decision, the appeals court upheld the law as a protection of patient privacy rights and said that the limits imposed by it were incidental. So, it appears that what this court decision says is that the doctor wants in his own time to go around and talk pro-gun, anti-gun, whatever, but when a patient's in there, they have no right to dictate gun policies or their opinions as though it's medical advice. And that kind of makes sense. That would be, like a psychologist sitting there and looking at somebody and saying, you shouldn't eat at Sonic ever because, it's fatty food. Well, last I checked, a psychologist is not a dietitian. Right? Or, even worse, it would be like a physician telling you that it's his medical advice that you vote liberal because, you need to have somebody else take care of you for the rest of your life. You shouldn't be doing it yourself. Let the government take care of you and be your sugar daddy. Not their job. They can sit there and give their political opinion all they want, but they can't diagnose and they can't put it as part of a treatment plan, which is kind of what it sounds like. Exactly what this law is forbidding is they can't, or according to the court decision now, they can't dictate politics as a diagnosis or as a treatment plan for something. So, interesting things kind of going on there with the Second Amendment, especially going over towards the East Coast there. A couple of years ago we had interesting things going on the West Coast with California being told left and right that your gun laws are bad, get rid of them. They break the Constitution. But let's move away from the Second Amendment a little bit, and let's move to general constitutionality and a little bit about the First Amendment. And let's hear what a representative from the District of Columbia has to say about what you're allowed to know and not allowed to know concerning what your government is doing.
You don't have a right to know everything in a separation of powers government, my friend. That is the difference between a parliamentary government and a separation of powers government.
You don't have the right to know, because that's the difference between a separation of powers government and a parliamentary government. Okay, first of all, just one quick lesson to Representative Eleanor Norton. A proper parliamentary government is a form of separation of powers government. If you look at England, which is a parliamentary system, they have a bicameral legislature. They have a House of Commons, elected by the people, and a House of Lords, elected by the nobility, the elite class. Then you have the executive branch, which is the Prime Minister, and the monarchs, i.e. the Queen and the Prince of Wales. And then you have their judicial branch. They're not necessarily equal, but there is a division, a separation of powers there. And it's a parliamentary system. Imagine that. Iraq has, or is about to lose, a parliamentary system. They have a president, they have a prime minister, they have a legislature, it's bicameral. At least was last I checked. They kept going back and forth between bicameral and unicameral. In other words, 2 houses or 1 house. Then they have their judicial system. And there's a separation there. They're using the separation within the executive branch between what the Prime Minister does and what the President does. So, separation of powers. But yet, parliamentary systems. The people are not allowed to know what's going on necessarily in a parliamentary system. The common people do not have an inherent right to know what's going on in the House of Lords. They may now, after laws are passed, but under the original way that the government was set up under Magna Carta, etc., with the Parliament, they don't. They don't have a say who's even put into the House of Lords, based on the original setup of the parliamentary system in Britain. Like I said, I'm sure things have changed since then, but that's the original establishment. Our country does not have a separation of powers government, as it's called by Miss Norton. That's not what we have. What we have is a republic. We have a democratically elected representative republic. That's the full long term. But it's, first of all, not a democracy. It is a republic, meaning we have representatives who vote for our laws and put them into action. If it was a democracy, we would vote directly for our laws. That's what a democracy is, otherwise known as mob rule. No, we have a republic. We have a bicameral legislature. There is a separation of powers based on the Constitution on what the legislature can do, what the executive branch can do, and what the judicial branch can do. And they're supposed to be separate but equal, each given their little responsibilities, or big responsibilities, delineated with checks and balances in place and co-equal. So it's not a complete separation of powers because there are checks and balances. If there was complete separation of powers, there would be no checks and balances. There are. But the responsibilities and authorities are divided equally between the 3 branches. Legislature passes laws and says we're going to put these on the books. Executive branch puts them in action. The judicial branch checks those laws against the supreme law of the land and says this fits the criteria or this doesn't of what is legal based on the Constitution, which is the supreme law. There is no higher law in our country other than the people. The people can change the Constitution. That's an Article 5 thing. So we can. So the people actually are masters of the Constitution. But the Constitution is the master of the rest of government. There is no higher authority. So, looks like Eleanor Norton failed her 8th grade civics class and hasn't learned a dang thing since. But let's go to that little part where she says that you don't have a right to know. Well, first of all, maybe she thinks a separation of powers government, as she calls it, means that those who are elected into power are elite and somehow better than and somehow above and somehow separated from those that they rule. We fought a war about that. That was one of the biggest things behind the revolution, is because of how removed the king was from what was going on in the colonies, that he became a tyrant because he was ruling by his will and not really looking at what was going on here. And of course the Second Amendment is what kicked off the revolution. They went to confiscate guns from Lexington and Concord, and somebody fired a round. Next thing you know is there was a gunfight and the war was on. And it lasted for several years afterwards, all over the confiscation of firearms. But here we have Eleanor Norton, saying that, first of all, I guess she thinks she's elite, she's above everybody else. Well, based on her knowledge of the Constitution and the way our government system is, she definitely is not above me in knowledge of how it's supposed to be. Sorry, lady, but you just declared yourself inferior because you can't read a simple 26-page long document called the U.S. Constitution. Yeah, you failed. That kind of lowers you from equal in my eyes. If you're equal, if you actually read the thing and understood it. Anyway, I digress.